Ladies, gentlemen, and everyone in between, I'm BurningDogFace, and I'd like to welcome you to the inaugural episode of Let's Read Darksiders The Abomination Vault. Okay, technically you guys will just be listening, but Let's Listen Darksiders The Abomination Vault is grammatically horrendous, so I'm not going to call it that. This novel was published in 2012 as a tie-in to Darksiders 2, but it's a completely self-contained original story that fleshes out the Darksiders universe. Now, I haven't gone and scanned every single page because that would be madness, but I can at least show you the back of the book as I give you the summary. Ride with the horsemen of the apocalypse as they seek to unearth a plot that could plunge all of creation into chaos. Ages before the events of Darksiders and Darksiders 2, two of the feared horsemen, Death and War, are tasked with stopping a group of renegades from locating the Abomination Vault, a horde containing weapons of ultimate power and malice, capable of bringing an end to the uneasy truce between heaven and hell, but only by unleashing total destruction. Created in close collaboration with the Darksiders 2 teams at Vigil and THQ, Darksiders The Abomination Vault gives an exciting look at the history and world of the Horsemen, shining a new light on the unbreakable bond between war and death. Okay. Before I actually begin, I'd like to note that because commentary would be difficult given the nature of what we're doing here, I'm just going to be reading it straight through, so anything you hear you can assume is coming from the novel and not from BurningDogFace. Once I get into it, that is. I'd like to mention that there's going to be a short introduction, then a prologue, and then it goes to Chapter 1. Other than that, I hope you have a good time. And without further ado, let's read Darksiders, The Abomination Vault. All right. Creation is not what you believe it to be. One world or one universe at the core of reality, crafted exclusively for humanity, presided over by a kind and benevolent Almighty, an eternal afterlife of reward or punishment, angels swooping above, loyal to a Father whose every purpose they understand and exalt. Hopeful misunderstanding at best, at worst, a deliberate lie. Oh, there was a creator, certainly, but what he intended, or even where he has gone, are mysteries to even the wisest of living minds. An afterlife? Hardly. No reward, no punishment. Only a purifying of the spirit, a purging of all memory, all self, before it passes through the well of souls to rejoin the flow of energy through creation, to form new souls for new generations. Angels? A hidebound, nearly stagnant people, and not remotely the eldest race of the cosmos, fighting in defense of a creation they only think they understand, slaves to the ancient traditions and laws of heaven. Yes, there is a heaven, and there is a hell, and oh, so many worlds above, below, and beyond. Worlds that the angels of heaven and the demons of hell would kill, and have killed millions of times over, to master. Only the Charred Council, not angel, not demon, not old one, but something other, holds the warring factions at bay. Only the Charred Council, and their fearsome servants, stand at the pivot point of all creation, protecting the balance from all who would see it shattered. Barely. Creation is far, far more than you believe it to be. And it is far, far older. Prologue. The light was by far the worst of it. Here, beyond the farthest outskirts of what could only laughingly be called the civilized reaches of hell, any visitor, of which there were precious few, should certainly have expected horrors. Nor would they have been disappointed. The cramped passageways of this particular sanctum were flesh scraped raw, a wet, glistening, infected pink. Perspiration and other fluids, both fouler and more intimate, seeped from the ever-undulating surface. Each corridor flexed and trembled, an orifice trying to clamp itself shut, held open only by a thin latticework of what might or might not have been age-browned gristle. Every footstep was treacherously slick. Every inhalation carried the acrid, choking stench of old sweat. Every hint of a breeze brought the echoes of unheard moans that might have been ecstasy, agony, or some unholy combination of the two. And still, the light was worse. It flickered and danced, as firelight should, but its rhythms were subtly off, unnatural. The ambient hue was a jaundiced yellow, painful to view, somehow hot and sticky on the skin. It brought a sheen of perspiration to every one it touched, as though the illumination itself were diseased. Scattered at seemingly random intervals in alcoves throughout the hallways and around the perimeter of a central chamber glowed the sources of that awful light. Thick, ugly candles, from 2 or 3 to almost 10 paces in height, arose from oily puddles. Only a close study of those waxen pillars revealed the figures encased within. Mostly demonic, some few representing an array of the old ones, and even the occasional angel. Each blurred at the edges, flesh melding seamlessly into the surrounding wax, and each melted slowly, so slowly, body and life and soul providing fuel for the flame. Flames that danced and flickered, not at random, but in time to the still beating hearts within. At one end of the vast hollow, nestled at the intersection of those passageways, sanity regained some semblance of a foothold. An array of gossamer curtains added a peculiarly stylish touch of color to the chamber. A raised dais, standing proudly against the wall of flesh, was constructed of mundane granite, although the interlaced web of gristle holding some of those stone blocks together spoiled the effect a bit. Atop that platform, a heap of demons writhed around a throne carved of marble, cushioned in supple skin and locks of hair. Pressed tightly together, they moved almost as a single mass. Most were humanoid, but beyond that they had little in common. Some were beautiful, some hideous, some winged and some earthbound, some male, some female, some both, and a few neither. They squirmed and thrashed, moaned and gasped, as every so often their mistress would reach down from her throne and stroke their exposed flesh with hands as soft as burial shrouds. Her skin was the deep purple of a nighttime storm, her dark hair wreathed in horns that only accentuated her unearthly allure, emerald eyes that could coax an angel to sin, and had on more than one occasion, a face to make a dead man ache, a figure to make a golem sweat. She was desire made flesh on a nearly divine scale. A palpable lust exuded from her like an animal musk with every gesture. Few, indeed, in heaven, hell, or between, could stand resolute before her. Most would have gladly allowed her to skin them alive, if only they might gaze upon her and worship her as she carved. Lilith, queen of demons, mother of monsters, lover and betrayer, temptress and traitor, creation's most exquisite lie. The chamber hummed, faintly but consistently, with the crackling of the candle flames, the sighs of Lilith's current favorites, the susurrus of her diaphanous silks, Lilith herself remained largely silent, however, her attention centered on the bulky figure standing at the foot of the dais, the source of the room's only meaningful sounds. Visitors and petitioners were rare here in Hell's outer reaches, and the domain of those demons currently out of favor, and this visitor, at least, had promised interesting things to say. He was cloaked and hooded in a tattered robe of gray, his features swathed in shadow, as though such a simple effort could possibly have kept his name from Lilith in her own home. Still, she'd allowed him his charade, and considered his words as he told her of his plans, and of what he'd hoped the Demon Queen might contribute to his efforts. He kept his gaze lowered as he spoke, perhaps a sign of deference, more likely a feeble effort to protect himself from the overwhelming strength of her presence. She found the attempt amusing. Why? When she finally spoke, interrupting the last of the stranger's presentation, her voice was thick, sultry, somehow enticing and repulsive at once. Addiction given speech. Why come to me with this? I thought I'd made that clear. The stranger's words, in contrast, were gruff, with only a hint of melody. Like a troubadour who has long since lost his voice. We all know that you dealt heavily with the Nephilim before their extinction, for all that you've kept the details of your relations hidden. You're said to know more of them than anyone, save perhaps the Charred Council. Who else has a better chance of unlocking the legacy they left Yes, yes, yes! Lilith ceased caressing the demons at her feet, long enough to wave her fingers in dismissal. Even that brief cessation was enough to draw a despairing cry from her pets. I understand that, idiot boy. I mean, why waste the time? It was courageous of you to come here. Some might say foolish. But to what end? What could possibly have made you think I'd want to involve myself in your scheme? The shabby hood twitched back, blatantly startled. I assumed that you would see the value in the power we might unlock together. You've no reason to love heaven or hell. You could lay waste to everyone responsible for your current status, perhaps even force the great factions and the Charred Council to restore what was taken from you. What was taken from me, Lilith hissed, leaning sharply forward, is of less importance than you seem to believe. Certainly not enough for me to set myself against all the forces of creation. I have my own projects, far more subtle than the wars you hope to ignite. You offer enormous power, yes, but power shared, power focused towards your own agenda. And I've no intention of abandoning plans already in motion. I will regain all that is mine, and more. But in my time, my way. You will, I'm afraid, simply have to unearth your precious secrets elsewhere. I see. The supplicant below her nodded. Then we have nothing further to discuss, I think. I should... Oh, I wouldn't go that far. Lilith stretched languidly in her throne, arching her back and pressing her breasts against the flimsy silks with blatant intent. I wouldn't want you to leave here unhappy. You wouldn't want me to leave here as a potential enemy, the other said, just in case I do succeed. He was good, this one. He almost hid the tremor in his voice, the quiver of longing in his body. I won't deny that. Lilith's lips, darker than wine, parted as she slowly ran her tongue across teeth that should have gleamed white had the ambient light not cast them as an almost lightning yellow. But surely you wouldn't want me as an enemy either. Not when we can part on better terms, and even an informal alliance could be so much more pleasant. She knew the effect she was having on him, the effect she had on just about everyone. It wasn't even seduction, not really. Seduction implied a choice, and Lilith's very nature stripped that choice from most sentient minds. She could practically see her influence crashing down on him in a deluge of need. He took a shuddering step, placing one foot upon the stairs of the dais, a hand reaching upward, and just as swiftly he straightened, pulling away. No, I'm not leaving as your enemy, Lilith. You can content yourself with that. but neither will I leave as your plaything." Lilith recoiled hard enough to rock the granite throne. For a long moment, her features twisted between astonishment and rage, slowly settling into a wary respect. "She must have been truly special to you," she said. It was his turn to recoil, clearly stunned and more than a little alarmed at his host's clear knowledge. Not only of his identity, but his history and motivations as well. "Go," Lilith commanded before he could draw breath to speak. "Before I decide to take offense. Go and find your toys. I'll be fascinated to see whom you invite to play once you have them." He was gone without another word. Lilith stared at the far wall long afterwards, ignoring the plaintive cries of her pets, her fingers drumming thoughtfully in the arms of her throne. Frowning within the shadows of his hood, the visitor marched stiff-legged through the fleshy corridors. Every curse in creation hovered about his lips, but he refused to give them voice. Not, at least, until he was certain he was beyond the range of Lilith's hearing. He couldn't afford to make unnecessary enemies. Not yet. Throughout his trek, he passed not one single room or passage leading off the main hallway. He had no doubt they existed. Presumably the flesh had some means of opening whenever an orifice was required. Beneath the robe, his own flesh crawled. Viscous fluids squelched beneath his tread or dripped on him from above as the corridor quivered. At one point, he stepped on a particularly soft and pliable spot, sinking nearly to his knee before the substance ceased to stretch, and was rewarded with an obscene sigh from somewhere far behind. It was actually a relief when he finally reached the door, or the hideous folds of leathery skin that passed for a door, and found himself outside Lilith's palace, on the blasted plains of hell proper. Blackened rock crumbled with every step, and he could feel his face cooking in the heat, for all that the great pits and pillars of flame were many leagues distant. Impossible spires, the homes and tower of potent demons, reached crookedly up from the horizon, like threads in the frayed borders of reality. For all the distance between him and that infernal society, however, he found that he was not alone. She was waiting for him, crouched idly on the cracked earth. She was, upon first glance, everything Lilith was not. Her features were broad and vaguely flat, not ugly, really, so much as shallow, as though carved by a sculptor who'd ultimately thrown down his tools and decided, close enough. Hair the color of cooling magma fell across shoulders clad in harsh, blocky armor. Her entire aspect was squat, even as she stood to greet him, and it took the hooded visitor a moment to realize that in fact he barely reached her chin. She was accompanied, one to each side, by a pair of only vaguely humanoid shapes, half her size, hewn of rough stone and covered in glowing sigils. Even without her artificial cohort, though, the visitor would have known her for a maker, one of the greatest of the progenitor races called, collectively, the Old Ones. "I could have told you it wouldn't interest her much." The woman spoke with the voice of a particularly gruff and surly avalanche. I'm sorry, what?" "Lilith, your plan. I could have free run of the complex, heard the whole thing. I could have told you it wouldn't interest her." A massive shrug made her armor shift slightly across her torso. She was desperate once to regain the knowledge and power that were stolen from her, but that was long ago. She's moved on to other goals, and they don't require the sort of brute force you're offering. "And you're certain of this because I've spent centuries trying to convince her otherwise. I cast my lot in with hers, abandoned my realm and my people, because I was fascinated at the thought of the wonders she might perform, might create. I've devoted far more time and effort than you, to no greater effect." The gray-robed figure reached up, scratched briefly at his hidden chin. "I see. And who are you, exactly?" "Belisatra." Another shallow nod. "I've heard of you. Lilith's pet maker." Belisatra scowled, and the two figures at her sides shifted idly. Stone scraping deafeningly against stone. You might devote some effort towards not being offensive, she told him, considering that I'm offering to help you. You? Why? Because if we succeed, I can make the Charred Council restore Lilith's power. I can stand at her side as she changes creation. And because Lilith aside, the legacy you seek is almost as fascinating to me as the greatest of her creations. He had doubts and suspicions, of course. Would have been a fool not to. And she'd have been as great a fool not to expect him to have doubts and suspicions. But in the end, where else had he to turn? All right, if you think you... But I want to see it first. The hooded man offered up a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. Why does everyone here insist on interrupting me? Then, before Belisatra could answer, You want to see what? The Maker laughed low and gravelly. Don't ever take me for a fool. You'd never have come to Lilith with this if you weren't absolutely certain they still existed. If you hadn't already found at least one of them. Besides, I can practically smell the emanations. I may lack Lilith's experience and expertise in the Nephilim, but I recognize their scent well enough. The robes shifted and shuffled, the hood twisting about as though checking for spies. Then, with a simple flick of the wrist, it sat in the shrouded traveler's hand. Not particularly impressive in any way, it was just a pistol, clunky and thick. The forge makers had been crafting sleeker weapons for centuries, if not longer. A complex array of multiple polygonal cylinders sat heavily at the weapon's center, rotating and revolving with ungainly clicks, feeding ammunition to the weapon's triple barrels. Belisatra frowned. I was expecting something more... She started to look away and found, for the barest instant, that she couldn't. The weapon seemed more solid, more weighty, more real than the man holding it or the Badlands plain on which they stood. It tugged at her gaze like a petulant child, refusing to relinquish its grip. She saw the inner workings of the mechanisms, though she couldn't possibly have seen. The gun didn't open, the pieces didn't slide apart. She simply saw inside the horrid thing, as well as out. She saw and she knew that the metal of the frame had melted down from treasured heirlooms and ancient works of art. Saw the tendons that wound through the jagged gears, the shriveled eye crammed between the barrels to assist the wielder's aim. The old blood still impossibly fresh, pumping through the iron itself. The hammers of bone and the seemingly infinite supply of teeth drawn through the dimensions to serve as projectiles. In its own way, it was far more disturbing even than the organic passageways that wound through Lilith's home. Those had been grown, but this had been taken, forged from the hopes and organs, synapses and souls of the living. On some primal level she could sense, but not quite hear, it still screamed. This, the traveler said, his own voice hushed and almost reverent, is black mercy. What? Belisatra took a step back, finally tore her gaze from the dead weight in his hand. What does it... Now? Now it simply kills. Now it's just a particularly potent gun with a rather distasteful shot. But at its height, when the Nephilim rode between worlds, trampling whole races as they passed, a soldier armed with black mercy could slaughter armies. This isn't a pistol, Belisatra. Black mercy is a handheld massacre, a herald of genocide. You and I, we're going to wake it up. And we're going to find the others. If, he added intently, challengingly, you're still game, of course. Yes. Again her gaze had locked on the weapon, but now their bond was one of fascinated avarice, not startled revulsion. Oh, you couldn't keep me away. Within the hood, teeth glinted in a crooked smile. Well then, my companion, a second flick of the wrist and black mercy disappeared up a voluminous sleeve. You get to suggest a starting point. I think I can do that. Her head cocked to one side. We'll need to gather my little helpers. She idly reached out, brushed her knuckles across the nearer of the stone figures. They'll try to stop us, you know. Let them. I know the ways of heaven and hell too well for them to. And the horsemen? Again he stopped mid-sentence. The Charred Council's attack dogs, what of them? The Belisatra smiled without an iota of mirth. You've heard of the horsemen clearly, and just as clearly you've heard nothing about them. Deadly, obscenely powerful, without mercy and all that? Yes, yes. No, I mean who they are. The 4 horsemen are the Council's enforcers, yes. They're also the last of the Nephilim. The other sucked in a breath. The Nephilim are dead. As a race, yes. But to the very last? Not quite. And should they learn of your efforts, our efforts, I can't imagine they'll respond kindly. A few calming breaths, and then... I don't much care how they respond, really. My quarrel is with the generals of the White City and the Dukes of Hell, not the horsemen. But after all they've done, I'm quite certain that not a single tear will be shed anywhere in creation when the Nephilim have gone well and truly extinct. So that will about do it for this first episode of Let's Read Darksiders The Abomination Vault. That was, one hell of a way to set the tone, wasn't it? I'm BurningDogFace, and I will see you next time when we continue on to the proper story, beginning with Chapter 1. Later!